Right. Hi, folks. So, in this short series of lectures, we're going to look at ventilation and perfusion and the physiology of respiratory exchange. We're going to go into some detail, but in this initial video, all we're going to look at is the overall picture of pulmonary function as it pertains to ventilation and perfusion. Let's focus on the diagram on the right, which is supposed to represent an alveolus and its adjacent pulmonary capillary. So as we know, the air is going into and out of this alveolus. Now, at the alveolar level, that is not really what happens. The gross movement of air occurs in the upper and lower airways down to the level about the small bronchi, but not beyond that. Beyond that, there's a constant exchange of gas, which is not cyclical as your breathing is. But the principle is the same. Fresh air comes in, and the air that is in the alveolus is slowly replaced by that. Now remember that the air coming in will be low in CO2, but the air going out will have a higher level of CO2. And the main purpose in terms of gas exchange is for replenishment of oxygen within the capillary, which will have blood flowing through it, and removal of CO2. How does this take place? Well, CO2 is produced as a byproduct of tissue respiration and is brought to the lung dissolved in oxygen, in the blood, in the serum actually. It's a very soluble gas. Whereas oxygen needs to be taken to the tissues from the alveoli to produce the substrate for energy production. The oxygen is less soluble and therefore is carried by hemoglobin. So the two gases we're going to look at are oxygen and CO2. Let's take oxygen to start with. Oxygen is not a very soluble gas. So as fresh air with 21% oxygen is brought into the alveolus, it interfaces at the alveolar membrane with the capillary membrane, and on the other side of that is a fluid with a low oxygen tension, hypoxic blood. So this is blood coming from the right ventricle through the pulmonary arteries into the capillary system. This is deoxygenated blood. In this state, oxygen diffuses from the alveoli into the capillary and is bound by hemoglobin. Blood becomes oxygenated, moves on into the left side of the heart to be distributed around the body. Important to note is the fact that oxygen is not very soluble and depends on combination with hemoglobin to be transported. Therefore, this system can be saturated. Once all four ligands on the hemoglobin molecule are occupied, that hemoglobin molecule cannot carry any more oxygen. So oxygen carrying can be saturated. When we look at oxygen transport at a global level, it depends on the flow through the lungs and the degree of ventilation, how much air passes through the lungs in any given time. So the minute ventilation, for example. If the ventilation drops, then less oxygen is being delivered to the alveoli, the partial pressure of oxygen in the alveoli will then fall, and the amount of oxygen available to be delivered to the blood also falls. That will lead to arterial hypoxemia, a low oxygen in the blood. Again, globally, if the blood flow to the lung is greatly reduced, for example, let's think about somebody with a massive pulmonary embolus, then the blood is not getting to that alveolar capillary interface, and even though there may be oxygen in the alveoli, that cannot be transferred to the blood because the blood flow has stopped, and therefore we become hypoxic. So that's one side of the equation. Let's look at the other side of the equation, the exchange of carbon dioxide. When we're looking at carbon dioxide exchange, we need to think about the solubility of carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is a lot more soluble than oxygen and actually is transported, just dissolved in the serum. When this blood with high CO2 levels reaches the alveoli, because it's so soluble, it rapidly exchanges with the alveoli, it passes through the membrane to the area of low CO2 tension, which is the alveolar sac, and then that CO2 is removed through the process of respiration. So the exhale there carries the CO2 out with it, therefore maintaining a gradient between the high CO2 in the pulmonary capillary and the low CO2 in the alveolus. So if there is a problem with ventilation, then there is no replacement of air in the alveolus. Eventually CO2 builds up in the alveolus, and there is no longer a gradient between the CO2 concentration in the blood and the CO2 concentration in the alveolus, and therefore there is no longer perfusion of CO2 from the capillary into the alveolus. CO2 collects. So in a situation of poor ventilation or poor respiratory effort, CO2 will collect. However, if ventilation is normal, but the blood flow through the lung is decreased, this has a much less effect on CO2 concentrations in the blood, and that's really because of the high solubility of CO2. So if the blood flow to the lung is decreased, once the ventilation is normal, whatever blood reaches the alveolus can partake in diffusion, and because the CO2 is so soluble, that can make up for the low blood flow, because once that blood gets in contact with the capillary alveolar membrane, the CO2 can diffuse into the alveolus where there's a low concentration of CO2, and therefore even with low blood flow, the CO2 can be eliminated. So if we think about that, it means that in a situation of poor ventilation, we're talking about globally now, poor ventilation, but normal lung perfusion, so things like respiratory obstruction, drugs that reduce respiratory effort, paralysis, altered consciousness with reduced respiration. In all of these, the oxygen concentration falls, the CO2 rises. That's type 2 respiratory failure. Whereas in situations where there's primarily poor perfusion of the lung, but normal ventilation, so pulmonary embolism, severe shock, other causes of reduced perfusion of the lung, once ventilation is normal, the oxygen concentration will be affected because that system can be saturated, and therefore with poor perfusion you can quickly get to a stage where there's not enough blood flowing through the lung to pick up enough oxygen because the system is saturated early. But because of the high solubility of CO2, poor perfusion with normal ventilation will affect the PCO2 much less. In these situations, you get type 1 respiratory failure. I'm going to stop there for this video, just giving you an idea of what happens in terms of ventilation and perfusion in the lung, particularly in relation to type 1 and type 2 respiratory failure. In subsequent videos, we will talk about regional differences in blood flow and ventilation to the lung, both in health and in disease. If you have any questions about this, you can bring it up in class. Thank you very much. That's all for this short video.